stated by members opposite. When will we see an end to these vindictive vaccine mandates?
Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan is the breadbasket of the world and leads the country in the production of wheat, canola, and many other crops. That takes fertilizer, lots of fertilizer. Recently, this government announced its plan to make Canadian farmers ration fertilizer by 30%, causing the price of groceries to skyrocket and leaving many Canadians going hungry. Mr. Speaker, why is this government punishing Canadians who simply want to eat?
$54 million wasted on the Arrive scam with millions of dollars missing.
And this government is going to spend more on interest on the debt than we do on national defense.
Mr. Speaker, since this Prime Minister took office and implemented his soft on crime policy, violent crime in Canada has risen 32%. 60% of Canadians say they've seen an increase in crime in their community. Families are afraid to take their children downtown. Businesses who are barely hanging on are seeing a decrease in customers because Canadians are choosing to stay home and feel safe. So will this Prime Minister do his job and punish violent criminals and protect innocent Canadians?
We learned this morning that the proportion of Quebecers suffering from food insecurity has doubled. It's gone to 15%. But these are people who have jobs, Mr. Speaker, but they can't buy groceries.
Mr. Speaker, for 2 years, Canadians have been living with COVID-19 restrictions. Restrictions on travel, restrictions on visiting loved ones, restrictions on worshiping. Children restricted from playing with other children or taking part in sports and other activities. 2 years of isolation that has inflamed Canada's mental health crisis and hurt our most vulnerable populations. Canadians just want their lives back. The Prime Minister needs to stop using the pandemic to wedge, divide, and stigmatize Canadians for his own political gain.
Mr. Speaker, what started with a message from truckers has turned into a cry from Canadians from across this country. They've had enough lockdowns and restrictions, enough mandates and job losses, enough of this government's overreach.
Because this Liberal government won't lift the mandates. Our Prime Minister's divisive words only add fuel to the fire. Prime Minister is doing nothing to stop the division he's created and give hope to our nation that is beautiful but weary. Mr. Speaker, what is the Prime Minister doing today to end the mandates and restore Canada's supply chains?
The Honourable.
2 weeks ago, the Ethics Committee unanimously, including all Liberal committee members, agreed that a tender be postponed to stop the Liberals from secretly collecting the mobility data of Canadians until MPs could be sure that the privacy rights of Canadians were not being violated. But yesterday, in an unbelievable move, the entire Liberal caucus, including the same members who voted for it, voted against stopping the RFP. What a disgrace. Why would the Prime Minister vote against the committee's recommendations to make sure that the privacy of Canadians were protected?
Mr. Speaker, prior to my time in Parliament, I served in municipal government. I was encouraged to speak up on behalf of the people who put their trust in me. I am concerned I do not have the same freedom to ask legitimate questions about this government or popular narratives of society. In the past 2 years, many of the people in my riding have expressed concerns about their rights and freedom. We say every Canadian has individual rights and freedom, but our right to free speech is under attack.
Mr. Speaker, a senior Liberal has shared their concerns that the government mandates are divisive and harmful to the Canadian people. The Prime Minister and his government need to stop politicizing the pandemic because it's fracturing our society and dividing Canadians.
The $700 billion spent on COVID created no new beds and none of the promised 7,500 doctors and nurses from this Prime Minister have materialized.
As it stands, the building is at risk of further deterioration. If we do not act now, a key piece of London's history could be lost. I've written to the Minister of Heritage requesting funding and now call upon this government to support this historical community treasure. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The liberty to speak freely, we cannot profess to be truly free. It is through the use of speech that most of us share our thoughts, our ideas, and our beliefs. This propels us forward. It facilitates innovation. Incredible. It also provides us with a means to criticize, to challenge, and to correct when we believe someone to be in error. This includes the government of the day, no matter the party at the helm. If we believe progressing as a society is important, then we must contend for free speech. After all, it is the very foundation of democracy. Which is why it is beyond alarming to me, then, that this government is moving forward with legislation that will censor free speech. I urge this House, therefore, and all Canadians to stand on guard and to do all that they can to contend for and protect free speech.
Mr. Speaker, the current NDP Liberal budget spending is the most outside of a crisis in 3 decades. It's driving runaway costs of living and rising inflation. Food is up 9.7% since last year, the biggest jump since the 80s. Gas is a record high, over $2 a litre across Canada. It's almost $3 in big cities like Vancouver and Montreal. It's hard in rural areas too. Since last year, fertilizer's up 44%, feed's up 8%, and farm fuel's up 32%. Why don't the Liberals care that Canadians are really struggling right now just to get by?
Speaker, the Liberals continue punishing Canadians for heating their homes and driving to work, while this leave-it-in-the-ground, left-wing, climate-zealot government is happy shutting down essential energy projects and adding more taxes. Even the PBO says that the government's claim that any sort of carbon tax rebate helps families is misleading. In fact, 60% of households in my province of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario are worse off because of the Liberals' climate virtue signaling.
Mr. Speaker, last night I spoke to Bonnie from a remote part of my riding who lives with her retired husband. They paid $900 last year to heat their home with oil, and that was double the year before. They just learned their bill this year is going to be $2,400. On a combined income of $25,000 a year, that means they're going to have to eat crickets in order to eat and heat.
I'm going to ask it again. Where is the olive branch? Because Canadians are looking for an olive branch, and I appreciate the olive branch she just extended to me right now. And I think that's what Canadians are looking for. Yes. The government doesn't have to agree. They don't have to even like the protesters and the trucks that are parked outside, but they need to provide a solution. So could they please tell Canadians what the solution is to get past this impasse?
You know, all that spending, Mr. Speaker, all that Liberal spending, Mr. Speaker, and we've only seen housing prices in Canada become the most expensive in the world. And the price of gas was $1.03 back in 2015. Now it's $1.40. How are people supposed to feed their families, fuel their cars, and get to work on that, Mr. Speaker? I'll ask again, is this the real change these Liberals were promising the middle class?
Mr. Speaker, thousands of people have come to their parliament and demand to be heard. They have come in defense of their fellow Canadians who are being denied their livelihoods by this Prime Minister. They have questions and concerns that have been mocked instead of addressed. Canadians have had enough. Enough of the fear and division. Enough of the wild and reckless spending by a government that just doesn't care. So the truckers and supporters are here on Parliament Hill to take a stand. He and this government must end their mandates and understand that a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian.
Mr. Speaker, and I apologize that minister is misleading Canadians. I do get very defensive of Canadians who are outside today, patriotic, peace-loving Canadians who are called misogynist and racist by the Prime Minister. So again, I will ask the Prime Minister to apologize to the peace-loving, patriotic Canadians who are outside right now just asking to be heard. Will he speak to them?
1.5 million Canadians had to visit a food bank in a single month.
I've done nothing wrong, he said with a sneer. But Canadians are worried because Christmas is near. Christmas without food, Christmas without meat, Christmas without toys, and without any heat.
Food prices are expected to be up $1,000 for the average family to $16,000 a year to feed the average family, an incredible sum.
Was the Prime Minister briefed about Beijing's election interference involving 11 candidates? The Prime Minister has been repeatedly asked this question, and he hasn't answered it. He hides behind carefully crafted words such as saying he wasn't briefed about candidates receiving money from China. But that isn't the question. When will the Prime Minister stop his stonewalling, stop his word parsing, and tell us what he knows about Beijing's election interference?
Mr.
The Liberals continue to deny that they're going after Canadian hunters with their latest gun ban, but the ban list is out, and hunters across the country have seen many of their commonly used firearms on that list. Hunters from Quebec, from Ontario, the Prairies, the North, our Indigenous hunters are all speaking out. Even legendary Montreal Canadian goalie Carey Price is speaking out, Mr. Speaker. And the CBC, in fact, just today said the list, quote, includes a number of long guns in wide use by Canadian farmers. So why won't the Liberals just admit that this was never about public safety and it was their target all along to go after law-abiding hunters, sport shooters, and farmers, Mr. Speaker? This was their plan all along.
Well, we'll see if the Prime Minister answers this one. Every opportunity he has had to de-escalate this situation in Ottawa and around Canada, he has chosen to hide, to confront, and to escalate. His divisive conduct has been a lesson in abject failure. Blockades should come down. They are already coming down across this country. But now the Prime Minister has invoked the Emergencies Act to punish Canadians who, in his words, hold unacceptable views. Why is the Prime Minister punishing Canadians for their political views?
The Honourable. Yesterday, during a press conference, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Some people will say we moved too quickly. Other people will say, no, we should have acted weeks ago. The reality is this: the Emergencies Act is not something to take lightly. It is not the first thing you turn to, nor the second, nor the third. So my question is, Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister please tell Canadians what first, second, and third actions he took before invoking the emergency?
Mr. Speaker, for 17 days, the Prime Minister didn't lift a finger over what was happening in Ottawa. Instead, he insulted people who didn't share his opinion. As a result, yesterday, the Prime Minister pulled out an act that hasn't been used for half a century. He didn't consult the premiers. He just informed them. And the Prime Minister is simply pouring oil on the fire.
For 2 years, the Prime Minister has insisted he is making decisions based on science. Canadians sacrificed, they isolated, closed businesses. Premiers are listening, but this Prime Minister believes he knows better and has invoked the Emergency Measures Act. Does the Prime Minister intend to force provinces to implement measures they and science disagree with?
The Honourable. Mr. Speaker, for weeks, Canadians looking for hope have been looking for a Prime Minister to listen to their concerns and listen to their needs as the rest of the world opened up. Instead, they heard from a Prime Minister with an escalating tone that left them feeling traumatized, stigmatized, and divided. Even today, he's calling out and blaming other parties who have been listening instead of pitting Canadian versus Canadian and showing real leadership. Why do Canadians have to pay with their freedoms to cover up for this government's failed leadership?
That they are safe from gun violence. But instead of protecting people, the Liberals made a last-second change unfairly impacting hunters, farmers, and Indigenous people and the tools they use for food security and protection.
Well, Canadians were hit with another interest rate uppercut today. Yeah, we're singing from a very different song sheet than this inflationary government. Canadians don't want to ban hunters, they want to stop criminals. Will the government get the message?